The winter of 1897 came to Jade Creek Valley like a creditor collecting debts. It arrived without ceremony, spreading frost across the window panes of the small wooden houses that dotted the eastern ridge, coating the bare branches of cottonwoods in ice that caught the pale sunlight and held it there, suspended as if the very light itself had frozen in place. The world outside was a canvas of white, as snow fell in a steady, silent curtain. Milin stood at her kitchen window, her breath forming small clouds against the glass. Behind her, the cast-iron stove radiated what little heat full logs could provide. And she knew those full logs represented half of what remained in the woodshed. The other half would need to last until the thaw, which the almanac predicted wouldn't come until late March. For months. She did the mathematics in her mind with the same precision she once used to measure flour for her husband's favorite bread. The kind, he said, reminded him of his mother's kitchen in Pennsylvania. Thomas had been dead 18 months now. The influenza had taken him in the summer of 1896 along with 17 others from the valley, including both of the Pritchard twins and old Samuel Worth, who had survived the war, only to fall to a fever he couldn't see coming. Milin remembered how Thomas had woken on that last morning, his face pale as winter wheat, and told her he felt fine, just tired. He was in the ground for days later, buried in the plot behind the Methodist church, where wild flowers grew in the spring, but where now only snow gathered in drifts against the headstones. She had managed through that first winter on what Thomas had set aside, the careful savings of a man who understood the necessity of preparation. But the second winter was different. The crops had failed that summer, what little she could tend on her own, withering in a drought that left the earth cracked and thirsting. The few chickens she kept had stopped laying in November, and she'd sold them to the Websters for less than they were worth, because everyone knew she needed the money, and charity wore the face of commerce in places like Jade Creek Valley. Now it was December 23rd, and the cupboard held 2 cans of beans, a small sack of cornmeal, and a jar of preserves she'd been rationing since October. Christmas dinner would be beans and cornbread if she stretched the meal thin enough. There would be no ham, no sweet potatoes, no pie cooling on the windowsill the way there had been every Christmas since she'd married Thomas 12 years ago. Milin turned from the window and looked at the empty kitchen table, its surface worn smooth by years of meals and conversations, the grain of the wood visible in places where the finish had rubbed away. She had scrubbed that table yesterday, though there was nothing on it to clean. The act had been automatic, muscle memory carrying her through motions that once held purpose. The silence in the house was a physical presence, thick and pressing. In the parlor, the clock Thomas had brought from Pennsylvania ticked away the seconds with mechanical indifference. She had thought in those first weeks after his death that she might eventually grow accustomed to the quiet. But 18 months had taught her that some absences only grew heavier with time, settling into the bones like cold, settling into old wood, making everything creak and ache with the weight of what was no longer there. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, small flakes drifting past the window in the fading afternoon light. The sky was the color of iron, and the temperature would drop further once darkness came. Milin pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved toward the stove to add another log, then stopped herself. Not yet, the cold could wait a little longer. The knock came just as the last daylight was bleeding from the sky. 3 sharp raps against the front door, deliberate and firm. Milin stood motionless in the kitchen, her hand still resting on the back of a chair. No one had knocked on her door in weeks, not since Mrs. Patterson had come by in early December with a basket of apples, and that particular expression women wore when they visited widows. Part pity, part relief that they themselves were not the ones living alone in a house that had grown too large. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Milin moved through the narrow hallway, her footsteps hollow against the bare floorboards. Through the frosted glass of the door's small window, she could make out a figure, broad-shouldered and tall, backlit by the last remnants of twilight. She opened the door a crack, and the cold rushed in like an uninvited guest. The man standing on her porch was Ben Garrett, her nearest neighbor, though nearest was a relative term when properties in Jade Creek Valley stretched across acres of stubborn land. His homestead lay 1.5 miles to the west, beyond the creek that divided their properties. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times since Thomas's funeral, always at a distance, a figure working in his fields or riding into town on that roan horse of his. They had never spoken, not properly. Thomas had mentioned him once or twice, said he was a man who kept to himself, which in Jade Creek Valley was considered either a virtue or a warning, depending on who was doing the considering. Milin, he said, his voice low and rough like stones turning in a riverbed. He held his hat in his hands, and snowflakes had gathered on the shoulders of his coat. His face was weathered, creased at the corners of his eyes in a way that suggested he had spent most of his 40-some years squinting into wind and sun. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, faded white against tan skin. Mr. Garrett. She kept her hand on the door, ready to close it if necessary. Women alone learn to be cautious, even with neighbors. I was heading into town tomorrow for supplies, he said, not quite meeting her eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder. Thought I'd see if you needed anything brought back. Roads are getting bad, and it's a fair distance for walking in this weather. The offer hung in the cold air between them. Milin felt something tighten in her chest, a sensation she had come to recognize as the complicated weight of being seen when she had worked so hard to remain invisible. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. But accepting help meant acknowledging need, and acknowledging need meant admitting how far she had fallen from the life she once knew. That's kind of you, she said, the words careful and measured. But I'm managing fine. Ben nodded slowly, still not looking at her directly. He turned his hat over in his hands once, twice. Right, he said. Well, the offer stands. If you change your mind, I'll be leaving at first light. He was turning to leave when Milin heard herself speak, the words coming from someplace beyond her control, beyond the walls she had built around her diminished life. Mr. Garrett, she said. He paused, half turned back toward her. Why? The question was simple, but it contained everything she couldn't articulate. Why now? Why her? Why this gesture that felt too deliberate to be casual kindness? He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Milin could hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods, the creak of the porch boards beneath his weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost reluctant. My wife died 3 winters back, he said. Childbirth. The baby, too. He looked down at his hat, at his hands that seemed too large and rough for such a delicate object. People brought food, checked on me. I didn't want it then. Thought I could manage on my own. He raised his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time, she saw something familiar there. The particular exhaustion that came from carrying grief like a second skeleton beneath the skin. I was wrong about that. Took me a long time to learn it, but I learned it. Milin felt her throat tighten. She had not known about his wife, about his loss. The valley kept its secrets well. Each homestead an island of private suffering. I don't need charity, she said, though the words came out quieter than she intended. No, Ben agreed. But maybe you could use a neighbor. He settled his hat back on his head and descended the porch steps, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. Milin watched him until he disappeared into the gathering darkness, his figure becoming first a shadow, then nothing at all. Only then did she close the door, leaning her forehead against the cold wood, feeling something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the first crack in the ice that had formed around her heart. Milin did not sleep well that night. She lay beneath the quilts Thomas's mother had sewn for their wedding, quilts that no longer held enough warmth against the December cold, and listened to the house settle around her. The wind pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the walls, the wood contracted with sharp cracks that sounded like bones breaking. She thought about Ben's face, about the way his voice had softened when he spoke of his wife and child, about the years of grief he must have carried alone in that homestead across the creek. She had built her widowhood like a fortress, brick by brick, each refusal of help another stone in the wall. It had seemed necessary at first, a way to maintain dignity when everything else had been stripped away. Thomas had been the one people liked, the one they sought out for advice or companionship. Milin had always been quieter, more reserved, content to exist in her husband's shadow. After his death, she had discovered that shadows without their source simply disappeared, and she had let herself fade, had chosen invisibility over the exposure of being pitied. But Ben had not offered pity. He had offered recognition, one grief meeting another across the distance they had both maintained. There was a difference there, subtle but profound, and it unsettled something in her that had grown comfortable in its stillness. Morning came grey and cold. Milin rose before dawn, as was her habit, and fed the stove with 2 precious logs. She made coffee from the last of her grounds, diluting it with extra water to stretch it further, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky lighten incrementally, the darkness giving way to a pale winter dawn that promised nothing. Christmas Eve. In years past, this would have been the day for baking, for preparing the goose, for polishing the good silverware that had belonged to her grandmother. Thomas would have brought in extra wood and evergreen boughs to hang over the doorways. The house would have smelled of cinnamon and cloves, of bread rising, of anticipation made tangible. Now there was only the thin smell of weak coffee and the underlying scent of cold that no amount of fire could quite dispel. She was measuring out cornmeal for what she had decided would be her Christmas dinner when she heard the wagon. The sound carried clearly in the cold morning air. The creak of wood, the jingle of harness, the steady clip of hooves on frozen ground. Milin moved to the window and saw Ben's wagon coming up the long drive to her house, the roan horse pulling steadily through the snow that had drifted across the path during the night. Her first instinct was to retreat, to pretend she wasn't home, but that was foolish. Smoke rose from her chimney, and besides, where would she go? This was her home, however empty it had become. She dried her hands on her apron and waited. Ben pulled the wagon up near the porch and climbed down with the careful movements of a man whose body had learned caution through hard use. He reached into the wagon bed and pulled out a wooden crate, carrying it up the steps with steady purpose. Milin opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Garrett," she said. Milin he held the crate in both arms, and she could see the tops of various items inside. A small sack of flour, canned goods, something wrapped in brown paper. "I got these from town. Thought you might could use them, seeing as it's Christmas and all." Milin looked at the crate, then at Ben's face. His expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away, but there was something in his eyes that reminded her of the way Thomas used to look when he was trying not to show how much something mattered to him. "I can't pay you for these," she said quietly. "Not now. Maybe in the spring after." "No payment needed," Ben interrupted gently. "Consider it a neighborly exchange. You helped my Sarah once before she passed. Brought her tea and sat with her when I had to go into town. She told me about it, said you were kind to her when she was feeling poorly." Milin remembered the afternoon he spoke of, though it had been years ago. She had indeed visited Sarah Garrett, had brought chamomile tea, and spent an hour or 2 in conversation. It had been nothing significant, just one woman checking on another, the kind of small kindness that passed between neighbors in isolated places. She had not known then that Sarah was carrying a child or that within months both she and the baby would be gone. "That was nothing," Milin said. "It was something to her," Ben replied. "It was something to me." He stood there holding the crate, waiting. "Will you let me set this inside, or are you going to make me stand out here in the cold arguing about it?" Despite herself, despite the tightness in her chest and the burning behind her eyes, Milin felt the smallest suggestion of something that might have been a smile. She stepped back from the door, making room. Ben brought the crate into the kitchen and set it on the table. He didn't linger. Didn't make a show of what he'd brought. "There's a ham in there," he said, nodding toward the crate. "Small one, but it should do for a proper Christmas dinner. Some potatoes, a tin of coffee, few other things." Milin looked down at the crate, at this unexpected abundance that had appeared in her empty kitchen like something from a parable. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands again, that gesture she was beginning to recognize as his way of thinking. "Because I know what it's like," he said finally. "To be so far inside your own grief that you can't see your way out. To think that accepting help means admitting defeat." He raised his eyes to hers. "And because nobody should be alone on Christmas, not if there's a choice about it." The words hung between them like something fragile and necessary. Milin felt tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, a pressure she had held back for so long that it had become automatic, reflexive. But standing in her cold kitchen on Christmas Eve morning, looking at this near stranger who somehow understood the particular shape of her solitude, she felt that reflex weakening. "I don't know how to do this," she said. And she was no longer talking about accepting the food. She was talking about the larger thing, the harder thing, how to let someone see her need, how to exist in the world again as something other than a ghost moving through the rooms of her former life. Ben nodded slowly as if she had spoken in perfect sense. "Neither do I," he said. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe we're both just figuring it out as we go." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "I've got a goose roasting," he said, not quite looking at her. "More than I can eat on my own. If you wanted to bring some of that ham over this evening, we could share a meal. Seems wasteful, both of us cooking alone in separate houses." The invitation was casual, almost offhand, but Milin heard the careful deliberation beneath it. He was offering her a way to accept that wouldn't feel like charity, a way to frame connection as practicality. It was kindness disguised as common sense, and she recognized it for what it was. "What time?" she heard herself ask. 6 o'clock. "Gives you time to prepare however you'd like." After he left, Milin stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking at the crate on her table. Then, with movements that felt both foreign and remembered, she began to unpack it. The ham was wrapped in butcher paper, substantial and real. There were 4 potatoes, their skin still dusted with earth. A tin of coffee that, when she opened it, released a smell so rich and familiar it made her throat ache. A small sack of flour, sugar wrapped in brown paper, a jar of honey, 3 apples, and at the bottom of the crate, wrapped carefully in cloth, a small loaf of bread still faintly warm. She sat down at the table and let herself cry, then quietly, her shoulders shaking with the force of holding back for too long. The tears were not just for the food, though that was part of it. They were for the recognition that she had been seen, that her struggle had been witnessed by someone who understood its weight. They were for Thomas and for the life they had built together, and for the terrible truth that life continued, even after everything you loved had been taken away. They were for Sarah Garrett and her baby, for Ben's 3 years of solitude, for all the ways grief isolated people in a world that kept turning regardless. When the tears subsided, Milin felt something she had not felt in 18 months, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. She rose and stoked the stove, adding wood without guilt or calculation. She filled a pot with water and set the ham to boil with the last of her cloves. She peeled the potatoes and set them aside. She made coffee from the fresh grounds, strong and black, and drank it, standing at the window, watching the snow fall across the valley in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. The afternoon passed in a rhythm she had forgotten, the rhythm of preparation, of making something for someone other than herself. She baked biscuits from the flour, small and golden, and wrapped them in a clean cloth. She polished 2 of the apples until they gleamed. It was not the elaborate Christmas feast she had once prepared, but it was something, an offering, an acknowledgement that she was still capable of giving, even when she felt she had nothing left. As the winter sun began its early descent, Milin changed from her everyday dress into the grey wool one she had worn to Thomas's funeral. It was the nicest thing she owned now, and though it carried those difficult memories, it felt appropriate somehow. She brushed out her hair and pinned it carefully. And when she looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw someone she barely recognized, older, certainly, worn by hardship, but present in a way she had not been for many months. At 5, she wrapped herself in her heaviest shawl and gathered the ham, the biscuits, and the polished apples into a basket. The walk to Ben Garrett's homestead would take her 20 minutes in the snow, and the temperature had dropped with the fading light. But Milin found she did not mind the cold as much as she once had. It felt clarifying, sharp and real, a reminder that she was still alive enough to feel it. The path to Ben's property followed the creek for half a mile before turning west through a stand of cottonwoods that stood like sentinels against the darkening sky. Milin had not walked this way in years, not since Thomas had taken her to meet the Garretts shortly after they had moved to the valley. That had been 5 years ago, maybe 6. Time had a way of blurring when marked only by seasons and losses. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and her breath came in visible clouds that dispersed quickly in the cold air. The The basket grew heavy in her arms, and twice she had to stop and shift its weight, adjusting her grip on the handle. Above her, the first stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky, small points of light that seemed impossibly distant and impossibly clear at the same time. As she walked, Milin thought about the various thresholds she had crossed in her life, leaving her parents' home to marry Thomas, stepping into the house he had built for them, walking behind his coffin to the cemetery. Each threshold had felt significant at the time, a doorway between one version of herself and another. This walk felt similar, though she could not have said exactly what she was walking toward, or what she was leaving behind. Perhaps it was not that simple. Perhaps she was carrying both with her, the grief and the possibility of something beyond it. The Cartonwoods gave way to open land, and she could see Ben's house in the distance, a low structure of weathered wood with smoke rising from its chimney in a straight line against the sky. Light glowed in the windows, warm and golden, and the sight of it made something catch in Milin's chest. It had been so long since she had walked toward a lit house that was not her own, so long since she had moved through the world with a destination that involved another person. Doubt crept in as she drew closer. What was she doing here? She barely knew this man. They had spoken perhaps a dozen words to each other before yesterday. What if this was a mistake? What if she had misunderstood his invitation, read too much into a gesture that was nothing more than rural courtesy, the obligation neighbors felt toward each other in isolated places? But even as these thoughts circled through her mind, her feet kept moving forward, carrying her across the snow-covered yard toward the porch steps. She could smell the goose now, the rich scent of roasting meat drifting through the cold air, and beneath it the smell of wood smoke and something else, bread perhaps, or potatoes. She climbed the steps and stood before the door, the basket heavy in her arms. For a long moment, she simply stood there, listening to the silence of the valley around her, the vast emptiness that could feel either lonely or peaceful, depending on how you held it in your mind. Then, before she could reconsider, before doubt could root her in place, she raised her hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if Ben had been waiting nearby. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of the house, and when he saw her, something in his expression softened, not surprise exactly, but relief, as if he too had been uncertain whether she would come. "Milin," he said, and stepped aside to let her in. "Welcome."